Are you aching for a love that will never leave? A presence that will push back the dark? If so, I have good news for you. God's love is relentless, even when your faith isn't. Welcome to the Relentless podcast, a 15-episode podcast designed to give you a behind-the-scenes look at the stories and biblical history that make up the pages of my newest book, Relentless, The Unshakable Presence of a God Who Never Leaves. My goal is twofold. One, to make sure you know you're not alone, and two, to help you discover evidence of God's presence in your story, even if your story doesn't look like you thought it would. My name's Michelle Kashat, and today we're going to talk about the introduction. Bum, bum, bum. I feel like we need to insert like a clip of the intro to Law and Order right here because, hello, that introduction is intense. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend that you pick it up. Today, we're going to just dive right into the deep end of the pool, and that's where the story starts. But it would be helpful if you had read the introduction before you listen to this podcast. If you don't have a copy of the book yet, just so you know, you can get a copy of Relentless at any major bookseller, including Amazon. You can order it right now, have it delivered within a day. You can also order it on Kindle and have it delivered to your Kindle or e-reading device immediately. So you could get it right now. Also, I recorded Relentless on Audible as well. So you can find the audio recording of me reading the pages of Relentless on Audible and get that right away as well. Just in case you need more of the sound of my voice, which, yeah, maybe not. There is such a thing as too much, Michelle. All right, so back to the introduction. To begin with, that introduction was very difficult for me to tell, that opening story. I wrote it. It's been a couple years since I wrote that opening story, but I have spent quite a bit of time over the last few years trying to decide if I was actually going to share it. I many times during the editing process, I thought about cutting it out. It's not easy disclosing that kind of frank honesty, that kind of vulnerability in this very public sphere. And to be quite honest, I tend to be a pretty private person. You wouldn't know it based on the books I write, but there's a lot that I keep close to my chest. I I I don't feel a need to just throw up all of those details everywhere. So it's very difficult for me to do that. In addition, my husband advised me not to. At first, when I wrote that, he didn't think it would be a good idea because he knows that vulnerability tends to invite criticism, and he knew that I'll probably be crucified online for sharing that. I had one friend say she couldn't even read the whole introduction without walking away. It was too much for her. Another friend said she was just shocked that I would go to that place at all. Uh, but ultimately, the reason I chose to leave it in the book and to really tell the truth about that basement despair is for you. Over the last several years, I have heard from hundreds of you, hundreds of email messages, direct messages on social media, public messages on social media, handwritten letters. I have a whole file in my cabinet of handwritten letters from men and women just like you, letting me know of the deep, dark struggle that they've had with their faith as a result of very difficult life circumstances. Uh, and for whatever reason, those who have written me felt safe to tell me that. But what it also told me is that they didn't feel safe in their home community, in their church community, in their families, in their friendships to tell the truth about their struggle with their faith, trying to understand a God who doesn't always heal, doesn't always take the pain away, doesn't always dot all the I's and cross all the T's. And so ultimately, I did this for you because I want if you hit a moment where you are in your own dark basement struggling with the will to live, I want you to know you're not the only person that's ever been there. I want you to know that there are some of us who have been there, still get there on occasion, but who have found God to be faithful and present even there. It's not been easy. It's not been nice and neat and pretty. I have lots of questions that I don't have answered, but I want you to know that you're not alone. The other piece is I think we need to talk about this. Uh, this whole concept of suicide, suicidal ideation, the very real impact on trauma, whether early childhood trauma or adult trauma, or like me, medical trauma, PTSD, and the resulting depression, anxiety, despair that comes from these kind of circumstances. We need to talk about it. It's real. Choosing to ignore it or minimize it or numb it or stuff it only makes the problem worse. Uh, we have to create spaces to tell the truth about our suffering. When we can do that in community, it takes some of the pain away. The other thing I want you to know as we talk about this was not my typical MO. All right. So I'm a firstborn, type A, very driven, achiever oriented woman. I tend to be very positive, upbeat. I have a good life. I have much to be thankful for. But what happened is I had multiple consecutive years of trauma and loss. I had what I could describe cumulative losses over about 2 decades, multiple losses, significant losses, including divorce, single parenthood, betrayal, church conflict, splits, ministry changes, 3 rounds of cancer, adolescence with my 3 boys, and then taking in 3 kids from an abuse neglect background and raising 3 trauma kids. All of that on top of almost dying, right? All of that happened in the span of a fairly relatively short amount of time. And the cumulative effect of all of those losses and all of that trauma is that I lost my will to live. I lost my fight. I remember multiple times telling my husband, I have no fight left. I have nothing more to give. I have no more fight. I mean, it was all I could do just to wake up and make it through a day. I had no fight left. Now, the other thing I want you to know in this place, and because I know some of you are wondering, is that at my lowest moment, so at my most difficult moment when I was really struggling the very most, I was running 4 miles a day. I was reading my Bible and praying every single day. I was journaling. I had a Christian counselor. I was eating very healthy, mostly a plant based diet, lots of vegetables and fruit. I was taking supplements, very little red meat, very little sugar, taking very, very good care of myself. I was sleeping 8 to 10 hours of sleep a night, taking a nap every single day. Uh, I was I was doing all the things that you're supposed to do to be as mentally and physically and emotionally healthy as possible. I was doing all the right things. And even then, even there, in spite of all that effort, I was continuing to sink. Uh, and the reasons for that are myriad. But part of that was the cumulative effect of so much pain, trauma, chronic pain, permanent functional disabilities, all the losses. I had some biological things that were going on that were impacting my mood. All these things were happening. But the reason I wanted you to know that I was doing, quote unquote, all the right things is that sometimes we like to blame people for their pain. Sometimes we want to point a finger at something that somebody is doing to cause their own situation. Because if we can point a finger and we can find a reason or a cause effect relationship between their suffering and what they're doing or not doing, then we think we can avoid it ourselves. It is so important for me that you understand that at times, there are times when people suffer and it's not their fault. There is a suffering that happens at times that is beyond a person's ability to bootstrap themselves through it. And that's where I was at in that opening chapter of the book. And that is really a big part of the reason why I chose to share it. We need to step back and pause before so quickly rushing to a place of accusation and judgment. There are people who have, and you know some of them, who have had a lifetime of dealing with depression, mental illness, chronic anxiety, multiple other different factors. Some have had early childhood trauma that they have been dealing with in therapy for decades, and they still struggle with it. And we are so quick to judge them because they don't just get over it, because they don't just get better. And yet I have personally experienced I mean, I've experienced it firsthand. I would have never guessed 10 years ago, but here I am, where I was doing everything that I could possibly do to dig out of my own hole, and I couldn't dig out. And what happens when you and I rush to judgment and blame rather than sitting in a place of compassion is we make people feel less, we make people feel more alone. This is the universal problem. Behind all of the mental illness, depression, anxiety, and the suffering and the PTSD and the trauma and all of this, the bigger problem is aloneness. All right? Aloneness. We feel alone. It is killing us, this isolation and aloneness. This is what almost took me under. It wasn't cancer. It wasn't even the pain, but the fear that I was completely alone in it. And in spite of my family and friends' attempts to help me, to support me, suffering created this gap, this distance between my experience and theirs. And this was only complicated by judgment or criticism or even my own internal sense of personal shame for feeling the way I did. I remember I kept telling myself, you shouldn't feel this way. You shouldn't feel this way. You should be grateful. You should be happy. You're alive. You should be thankful. And so all of those messages of shame, and then others around me saying, oh, you're fine, it's not that bad, it's not that bad. All of those things just piled up. So on top of cancer and pain and losses and the mourning and the trauma, we had all of this judgment, criticism, shame, and denial, quite frankly. That was weighing down on me to leave me in this hole of despair that I was struggling to get out of. So today I just wanted to give you some of the ways that some of the strategies that I use to climb out of it. And you need to know, first of all, I'm not in as bad of a place as I was a couple years ago. However, I still have really bad days here and there. More often than I would like. I still have days where the pain and the losses are too much. They wear me out. I'm tired. And so I use these strategies on a regular basis because I know that those bad days are not going to go away. It's not like all of a sudden everything's going to be fine and I'm going to be great and everything's going to be hunky-dory. So these are the strategies that I use when I notice that I'm in that place of despair. I want to share them with you today because chances are you're going to have a day or two here and there, maybe every day, where you feel buried. Okay, you feel buried by life, by questions, by doubt, by pain, whatever it is. If you are not there, but you know somebody who is, these are also strategies for you to help the person that's in that place of despair. To begin, it begins with acknowledging it or noticing it. You simply have to notice, acknowledge the reality. Rather than tell yourself, you shouldn't feel this way, tell yourself, I see you, this is how I feel. Despair, I see you, I recognize you, we've been here before. If you are a loved one with somebody else who's in that place, to simply notice and say, I see you. I see how hard this is for you. I see how painful this is for you. I recognize it. I'm not going to ignore it. We need to notice it. The brain acts like a smoke detector, okay? The brain is like a smoke detector. If you don't acknowledge that it's going off, it's going to keep going off, okay? So I actually had a smoke detector going off in the house this week. And I was in the middle of interviews and I couldn't do anything about it. And let me tell you, I kept ignoring it and it kept going off. And what happened is it started getting louder and louder and more frequent until I was about ready to scream. Your brain is the same way. So if you are feeling sad, full of grief, full of despair, overwhelmed, if you are struggling with depression or sadness or whatever it is, You have to notice it. You have to acknowledge that your brain is going off. It's telling you something. Then, second, you can't just stop at the noticing. You need to connect. This is what I talked about before. Really, the biggest pain behind the different kinds of pain that we experience is aloneness. This is what causes us the most grief. We have to connect. So, tell one trusted friend. Tell at least one trusted friend, and all you have to say is, I'm not okay right now. One thing that I do with I have a couple friends that I can text when I'm having a tough day, and I tell them I'm not okay right now. I'm safe. I'm safe. I'm not gonna do anything rash, but I'm not okay. I just needed you to know I'm not okay. Isolation is the worst thing you can do in a place of pain, because isolation makes the pain worse. And instinctually, unfortunately, it's what we want to do, right? When we're in pain, we want to hole up and isolate. We want to kind of pull away, shut down, self protect. It's the worst thing we can do. So instead, what we need to do is to tell one trusted friend, I'm not okay right now. If you are a loved one of somebody who's suffering, what you need to do is simply say, I'm here. I'm here. In addition to that, it's not easy being the support person for somebody who has long term mental illness or depression or is really suffering. So make sure you reach out and connect as well. Find somebody you can trust to say, man, I've got a child with depression and she's really struggling. I just need you to know I'm tired, I'm weary, I need your support. And then third is to move. I need to do something to interrupt the thought loop. So if I'm really in that despair cycle, that sad cycle, that pain cycle, I need to do something to interrupt the thought loop. On my good days, I can go for a walk outside. I can go for a run. I can do something physical. But most times it's simply I need to move. I need to change the room that I'm in. I need to do a different activity. Sometimes it's as easy as reading a good novel, just something simple to change the thought loop. Play solitaire on my phone, something to interrupt that thought loop. If you're a loved one, you can push in, you can stay close, you can sit next to the person that's in a bad place. You can refuse to take things personal. That's a really big one. Don't take their lack of ability to connect personal. You may need to enlist the help of a professional. But whoever is suffering needs to know that they're worth coming after, that they're worth pursuing, they're worth being with, even if they are crying the whole time. But move. And fourth, say to yourself, and I do this quite regularly, this will not last forever. I will not feel this way forever. This is how I feel tonight, but chances are by tomorrow morning, I will feel differently. This will not last forever. And then finally, and this is kind of after I interrupt that thought loop, I move, I remind myself it won't last forever, is I identify any extraneous factors that might be contributing to my mood. If I'm in a particular moment that feels crushing, I go back to that acronym HALT: hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Am I hungry? Am I angry? Am I lonely? Am I tired? What time of day it is? I notice that the hardest times of day for me are after the sun goes down. By then, the pain is higher. I'm tired. I have less ability to deal with all the things. So I try to look at extraneous factors and do what I can to meet those needs. If I'm hungry, I eat. If I'm angry, I process somehow. I journal, talk to my husband. I do something to process, go for a walk. If I'm lonely, I reach out and make a connection. If I'm tired, I sleep. More times than not, I'm tired and I just need sleep. For me personally, I ended up finding out that I had pretty severe hypothyroidism based on radiation killing my thyroid. So I have to do regular doctor's appointments to stay on top of my physical health. On top of that, I most likely have celiac disease, so I had to change my diet. But all of those different biological factors were contributing to my despair. Resolving those biological factors didn't take care of all of my despair. I still have deep sadness and lots of chronic pain, but it certainly helped. And the final thing that I do is I create index cards with verses on it or truth statements on them that I can carry around with me and have at the ready at all times. I need to remind myself of truth. So, if that's where you are, these are some strategies that I use. I notice it or acknowledge it. I connect with at least one trusted, safe person. I move, do something to interrupt the thought loop. I remind myself, I say out loud, this will not last forever. I will not feel this way forever. And then I identify extraneous circumstances that might be contributing to the despair, depression, sadness, grief loop that I'm in. To give you an update, it's been a few years since that story that takes place in the introduction of Relentless. And I'm in some ways doing much better. But as I mentioned before, I still deal with a lot of physical and emotional fallout from trauma. It's just that's the reality of it. It's still there. And I know for a fact this isn't the last time I'm going to have a dark night, a difficult day, or a hard story that I need to process through. So the question is, how do you and I anchor our faith so it will stand no matter what comes? How do we anchor our faith in such a secure, tangible way that it will stay strong even when we deal with the worst of circumstances? And that's really the message of the whole entire book. So in Relentless, I walk through the 12 altar stones, and in the next episode, we're going to dig into altar stone number 1. But it's a story in Joshua. So let's talk about that real quick. Joshua 3 and 4 is the story of Joshua and the Israelites crossing the Jordan. They had escaped 400 years of slavery in Egypt. Then they had spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Not super fun, let me tell you. Imagine camping out in the desert, eating the same food every day, not having a place to call home. That's what it was like for them. Finally, God was going to take them to the promised land. This place that was basically what you and I would dream of. Like it was in their minds the life that they had always wanted. It was up ahead. The promised land was up ahead. As they were on their way to this promised land, this dream life, they bumped up against the Jordan River. Now, the Jordan River was running at flood stage. It wasn't a creek. It wasn't a tiny little stream. It was a raging river, and it was terrifying. It was impossible. There was no way they could get through, and that the only way to get to the promised land was to walk through the Jordan River, which would drown them. I mean, that's just the facts, right? They would have drowned. What God told them to do, they had priests within this whole group of Israelites. He told the priests to walk into the middle of the Jordan River. The priests were carrying the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was the tangible evidence of God's presence with them. God's presence was said to dwell in the ark. The priests were carrying the ark. So basically, God said, I want you to carry my presence into the center of the Jordan. Well, the minute that the Israelites, the priests, the minute that their toes touched the water, the Jordan River split in two, the water piled high up on the side, and the Israelites were able to cross through the river to the other side. I mean, a miracle, right? Incredible. Wouldn't we all like to have that kind of deliverance? But what is most fascinating about this story is what God told the Israelites to do after they got to the other side. And that's what I'm going to read. Joshua 4. When the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up the 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight. So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and said to them, go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulders, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, where do these stones, or what do these stones mean, tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. In short, God told the Israelites to go back to the middle of the Jordan, the center of their harrowing experience, the center of that impossible circumstance that they would have never survived without God's intervention, to pull out 12 stones from that center and to set those 12 stones up as an altar, a memorial of what God had done. He wanted them to set up those 12 stones as a memorial because he knew this would not be the last time their faith would be tested. He knew that there were more hard things to come, that there would be other things in their lives that would seem impossible, and he wanted them to remember his presence in the middle of their worst circumstances. So he had them set up those 12 stones. Now it's your turn. This is what I want you to do through the pages of Relentless. With each chapter, I want you to go back to a different part of your story, an impossible circumstance, a harrowing experience, something that seemed impossible at the time. I want you to find evidence of God in the middle of it. Evidence of God's presence in the middle of it. I want you to pull a stone from that story. That can be a literal stone or it can be a figurative stone. It doesn't matter what it is. It can be a stone that you write a word on. It can be a piece of paper. It can be a trinket that you remember from, whatever it is. But I want you to collect 12 items that represent God's presence with you in the middle of an impossible circumstance. Then, by the time we finish reading the last page of Relentless, you will have a 12-stone altar testifying to God's presence with you, even in the middle of the impossible. This is what it's about, because sooner or later, you and I will have more difficult things to face that will make us question our faith. And I don't know about you, but I want the kind of faith, I want the kind of belief in God that stands no matter what comes, no matter what happens, whether or not I get another diagnosis, regardless of the choices my children make, what happens with my family, my marriage, my home, my work, my health, no matter what it is, I want to remember the faithfulness of God in the middle of it, even if my story doesn't look like I thought it would. All right? We have work to do. I'm so excited. Thank you for joining me today, friends. Life is so much sweeter when we don't have to do this alone. Even better, we have a God who will never leave us, will never stop loving us. I will not leave you as orphans, he promised. I will come for you. And I believe him. Now, that's something worth living for. Are you aching for a love that will never leave? A presence that will push back the dark? If so, I have good news for you. God's love is relentless, even when your faith isn't. And the circumstances you fear might drown your faith could become the stones giving testimony to it. Join me and let's find evidence of him together.